welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. Ever since I started looking in detail at the question of humanity's ascension into a higher state of reality, whether it be considered a higher state of consciousness or our transitioning upward from three-dimensional reality to the higher vibrational frequency of the fifth dimensional reality, I can't help but think of all of the times ordinary people from all over the world have claimed that they were visited by otherworldly beings who came for the specific purpose of sharing a dire warning about humanity's future. And of course, the options that we have here on Earth that could determine our collective fate. The warning may have differed over the ages and may have been interpreted in a variety of different ways, depending on who it was that was present to receive that warning. But we do appear to have many instances in which a vision or an apparition of a celestial being of some kind has been reported by either an adult or a child or a group of adults or children, or even a crowd of people all at once. It doesn't seem to matter where you are in the world or who you are in the world. You are just as likely to experience a moment in your life when someone or something not in keeping with this earthly existence suddenly and inexplicably comes into your life. These episodes have been reported to have taken place quite consistently over the past few hundred years, and they have ranged from spiritual or religious by nature types of encounters, from that to something more closely resembling an encounter of an extraterrestrial origin. Let's take a look at some of these encounters. I'm specifically interested in seeing whether the messages shared by these otherworldly beings, regardless of who they are, eventually prove themselves to be accurate predictions of the future, and whether there are commonalities across the broad spectrum of types of encounters that people have reported having seen or having been a part of. So let's begin with visitations of a spiritual or a religious nature, because these kinds of episodes have been painstakingly documented over the years and have also been some of the most closely scrutinized episodes of encounter. They've been scrutinized by the church establishment, by government entities, and somehow belief in whether the visitation occurred has stood the test of time. These particular events are collectively referred to as Mariology or Marian apparitions. They're described by the Catholic Church as being supernatural visions of Mary, Mother of Jesus. I think it's important in the first instance to reflect on the fact that the lady that was seen in the visions was assumed to be Mother Mary of Jesus. We don't actually know who she was. And for someone like me who isn't a particularly religious person, I like to keep my options open as to who she might have been. However, what we know for sure is that in every instance that the church has investigated and ultimately approved as being legitimate, these sightings, the vision involved a woman of extraordinary beauty who was assumed to be Mary, Mother of Jesus. Maybe she was, but I'd rather just keep my options open, keep my mind open as to who or what she might have actually been. Because sometimes these visions don't always appear to be interpreted in a religious or spiritual context by the person involved. But that doesn't mean that they aren't experiencing the same thing as a person who does interpret it in a religious way. Perhaps they are, but perhaps they're just seeing something from a different perspective. And that is the precise reason why I want to look at this phenomenon in today's episode, to see if perhaps people of different perspectives are potentially experiencing the same thing, but just not realizing it. So the Catholic Church has investigated and approved as legitimate or worthy of believing around 100 or so visions that have occurred from around about the early 15th century up until the current day. There have been many more sightings than that, many more, millions of them. But of course, most of the sightings were only reported by a single person. They never reoccurred, or they couldn't be verified, or even maybe even investigated. So the church hasn't gotten involved in those examples. Of the sightings that were investigated, the level of approval by the church has varied. Some visions have simply had full approval. Others were approved for pilgrimage by followers, but there was no opinion given as to whether the vision was real or had been confirmed. And an example of one of those visions involves ongoing reports and hundreds of thousands of witnesses over a 40-year period up until the current day. This particular vision has been taking place in Bosnia since 1981 and has included astrological phenomena like, for example, the miracle of the sun, which is said to be when the sun appears to be following a cycle of changing colors in the sky and then appears to grow larger and larger as though it's falling downward towards the earth before, of course, it returns back up again. Also, there have been reported healings taking place, metals changing from silver to gold, and other seemingly impossible phenomena at the site. This particular series of visions has been approved by the current Pope Francis in 2019, and thousands of people travel to Bosnia to be part of these sightings every year. So let's look at some of the most recently reported visitations by the lady in which she shared a prediction with the experiencers. In 1858, for example, a 14-year-old girl in Lourdes in France reported a visitation by the lady while she was gathering firewood out in the countryside. She claimed that the woman directed her to a nearby spring and predicted that spring would give healing to many people. Since that time, over 60 different medical cures have been directly associated with those spring waters. The church has deemed the encounter miraculous. As recently as 2014, an independent scientific study was published in the Journal of the History of Medical and Allied Sciences about this phenomena, which states that the cause of these 60 episodes of healing are, and I quote, currently beyond our knowledge and impressive, incredibly effective, and continuing to await a scientific explanation, unquote. In 1917, three children in Fatima in Portugal reported a visitation by a lady who subsequently returned at the same time and day every month for 7 months. The lady accurately predicted the early death of two of the children. And as the visitations continued, more and more people gathered to witness related events. On the final visitation day, healings are reported to have occurred, along with the miracle of the sun. These phenomena were witnessed by around 70,000 people who had gathered at the time of this last sighting. The lady gave a number of predictions which are referred to as Fatima's secrets. One was a prediction of the end of World War I and the start of World War II. Another related to the fate of various popes, bishops, and other church followers. Pope John Paul gave thanks to the Lady of Fatima for having saved his life as a result of these predictions. He was shot in 1981 but survived because of the warnings that he claims she had given about his future. And another prediction was framed as a request by God to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. What this meant was that the church should perform a ceremony to acknowledge the divinity of Mary as it relates to the country of Russia. The way the prediction went was that if the consecration didn't occur, Russia would continue to spread wars around the world, but that if it did occur, then peace would ultimately prevail. Strangely, no consecration of Russia occurred until 2022, nearly 100 years after the prediction. Shortly after the day of the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine, suddenly Pope Francis performed the consecration ceremony for both Russia and Ukraine. We are yet to see how that impacts the world or whether it does at all. In 1973, in Yuzawade, Japan, a nun reported seeing one of the convent statues of Mother Mary illuminate and also begin crying. She claims that she also received messages, seemingly, from the statue, despite the fact that the nun was deaf. Over the next few years, that same statue was found to be crying on 101 different occasions, and the phenomena was even recorded for broadcast on Japanese television. It was witnessed by many, many people. There were also 4 instances, some lasting days at a time, in which one of the hands of the statue was seen to be bleeding. I actually recall seeing news reports about this myself when I was a child, all the way over in Australia. The reports were that the Mary statue had been carved from a single piece of wood and it stood 3 feet in height. There was no known way for the bleeding or the crying to occur. The messages that the nun received were apocalyptic in nature and prophesied what would occur if humanity didn't act in better ways. The prophetic elements of the messages are stated as follows, and I quote, "As I told you, if men do not repent and better themselves, the Father will inflict a terrible punishment on all humanity. It will be a punishment greater than the deluge, such as the one that we will have never have seen before. Fire will fall from the sky and will wipe out a great part of humanity, the good as well as the bad, sparing neither priests nor faithful. The survivors will find themselves so desolate that they will envy the dead. The work of the devil will infiltrate into the church in such a way that one will see cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops opposing bishops. The priests who worship me will be scorned and opposed by their colleagues. Churches and altars will be destroyed. The church will be full of those who accept compromises, and the demon will press many priests and consecrated souls to leave the service of the Lord. The demon will be especially cruel against souls dedicated to God. The thought of the loss of so many souls is the cause of my sadness. If sins increase in number and gravity, there will be no longer pardon for them." Unquote. I found this particular set of predictions quite interesting. This was given to the nun in early 1975. It was actually the lady's last message communicated to the nun, as previous messages had been conveyed, but they were more general in nature and didn't include predictions or, warnings of any kind. This one did. And what I find interesting about it is that it appears to be in play right at this very moment in time. Possibly because, remember, when it comes to this kind of thing, perceptions and perspectives can differ among people. So let's just look at this a bit more closely. The lady who appeared to the nun in Japan between 1973 and 1975 ultimately told her that the devil would enter the church using a demon to infiltrate the minds and hearts of the faithful church followers. The demon would turn church leaders against each other, and some places of worship would be destroyed, and that many of the religious faithful would actually be remaining in the church but sitting in alignment with the demon. Those followers would have compromised their faith in order to follow or succumb to the demon's trickery. So all I've done here is that I've modernized the language of the prediction slightly to help us to identify how it might be happening right now. So you tell me, is there something happening in the world today that has the church divided? Is there a demonic kind of presence that has infiltrated many church believers? And are they compromising their faith in order to follow and perhaps even worship that demonic presence? Before we get carried away, think about what the word demonic actually means. It means fiendish and diabolical. A demon is a creature that creates chaos and torments people, terrorizes them, acts like an emotional monster that leaves them in a panic, feeling fearful of a presence that seems evil, even if it can't be perfectly defined or recognized. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Because it might, depending on your perspective. And if it doesn't sound familiar, is that because perhaps you are one of the compromised, as described by the prophecy? In the past, say 10 years, there have been a lot of bombs, shootings, fires, and other attacks against places of worship. Not any particular denomination. Mosques have been attacked, black churches, synagogues, And of course, white churches, racially mixed, and non denomination churches as well. There is also a phenomenon taking place with people leaving the church in unprecedented numbers. But very recently, a lot of this is happening with regards to some of the political phenomena taking place, particularly in America. And in some places of worship, priests are actually telling parishioners who to vote for. They are declaring the other side of the political spectrum to be, and I quote, demons. It's uncanny, isn't it? I mean, it's not for me to decide whether this particular set of predictions is coming true, but it is an interesting overlap of circumstances. So I wonder, the crux of it, though, is actually about how humanity must become better. Um, Live with greater compassion towards each other, towards the world, and everything in it. That's the key message. And everything else is about what will progressively be taking place while we delay doing what we need to do. We simply need to take more care about one another and the world that we live in. Yeah, the messages are always the same. Anyway, let me continue. In 1945, a 9-year-old boy in the Bronx in New York was with friends playing outside his home. They all saw something they couldn't define floating above a nearby house. When they went to investigate, the young boy felt a sense of unease, and so he said a few Hail Marys under his breath to ease his nerves. He later claimed that as soon as he spoke those words, the floating item transformed into a shimmering and beautiful young woman. She told the boy to return at the same hour for the next 16 nights and warned that the world needed him to pray for world peace. He obliged and returned with his family and a growing number of other interested people. By the 16th day, there were a reported 20,000 people who came to the spot of the visitation. For the remainder of his life, the young boy was considered to be a healer, and he continued to visit the site of the visitation every day at 7 p.m. until old age and frailty prevented him from doing so. Between 2000 and 2009, there have been a number of reported visitations occurring in Egypt as well, including at Giza, where the pyramids and the giant Sphinx are located. Many thousands of people have witnessed these episodes, and numerous photos and video evidence have been collected and shared with the media. Some of the visitations or some of the visions occurred repeatedly during religious mass and involved pictures inexplicably illuminated with light or capturing light in segments of the picture. There was also an event on the 11th of December in 2009 above a church at Waraq al-Hadar in Giza in Egypt, during which a full-length apparition of Mary, Mother of Christ, appeared to hover above the dome of the church. For 3 hours it took place, and it was seen by the entire local community of people, plus numerous reporters, photographers, and other witnesses. The vision appeared to float between the church's domes, emitting light. Since then, many have reported seeing white pigeons continuously circling that same dome at night, as well as a star, which emerges suddenly from the sky, darts back and forth across the sky, and then disappears out of sight. Moving out of the religious realm and into the extraterrestrial realm now. Some time ago, I read a book by a fellow called Michel Desmarquet. Michel was born in Normandy in France in 1931 and had served in the military in French Equatorial Africa, after which he spent a number of years managing coffee plantations and working as a salesman in a variety of industries. In the 1970s, Michel and his family moved to Queensland, Australia, where he established a small farm near the most northern point of the country, and he settled in to grow vegetables for commercial trade and also to raise a few livestock. Michel was living a pretty ordinary life. He had previously been a religious man, but I'm not sure if he still was a practicing Christian when this encounter of his happened. It was June 1987 when Michel claimed that he had been contacted by an extraterrestrial being from the distant planet of Theuba. Theuba was described to be the ninth planet of a potential 12 planets in our solar system. The person that he encountered and who he spent most of his time with during this encounter was a tall, shimmering, beautiful woman called Teo. Well, he thought she was a woman until it transpired that she actually turned out to be a hermaphrodite. He was very disappointed. Michelle claims to have gone on a 10-day journey throughout the Galactica with Teo and other similar styled extraterrestrials. They were, in fact, almost identical in their physical description as the tall celestial beings that Chris Bledsoe claims escorted him to see the shimmering lady in white back in 2012. If you aren't aware of Chris Bledsoe's story, I talk about him in quite a lot of detail in previous episodes and also have a playlist devoted to his experiences on the Ellie Dreams Done Under channel on YouTube. You can find the links in my bio here at KGRA. So anyway, during Michel Desmarquet's journey around the galactic area, the galaxy with the extraterrestrials, he was given a number of warnings that he was instructed to share with all of humanity. The warnings were detailed in nature and related to 5 or 6 different general topics. These included environmental degradation and the responsibility for humans to protect the Earth and act as stewards for the planet, including advice for conservation of the planet, sustainable practices, and the protection of natural resources. These advanced extraterrestrial beings also instructed Michel to write a book about his experiences and to outline in detail the warnings that they were sharing with him. Other topics for discussion that formed part of these warnings related to greed and over-reliance on materialism, the controlling nature and misuse of money, risks associated with religion, and in particular the design of religion, which was described as being for the purposes of controlling and misdirecting humanity for the benefit of a small group of elites. They also warned about reliance upon the current governmental system of control and the need to replace current societal and political systems with something closer to or more akin to a global brotherhood. And I think that included bartering systems rather than money as well. When it comes to the topic of universal brotherhood, the extraterrestrial beings emphasize the need for people to demonstrate more compassion towards each other and to have greater respect for issues of diversity, including nationality, race, spiritual belief, and they warned that hatred and division was destroying humanity's chances for survival from within. The extraterrestrials also cautioned against the misuse of advanced technology. They highlighted the potential dangers of nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence. Now, we are talking about the 1980s here. And so, yes, artificial intelligence probably existed, but it was very immature, at immature stages, or in its early form. This was a time when artificial intelligence wasn't even universally known about or used at all. And it wasn't heavily used by countries or companies or governments in any significant way either. Yet somehow the extraterrestrials, or perhaps even just Michel Desmarquet, seemed to be well aware of the dangers of things like artificial intelligence. The extraterrestrials also warned about the types of energy consumption humanity was utilizing and warned specifically against the over-reliance on fossil fuels. They questioned why people didn't experiment more with hydrogen energy and suggested that those same elites in society who want to control others were putting the earth and its people in danger with their greedy monopolization of energy systems and choices. The extraterrestrials also expressed concern that humanity lacks awareness of its place in the cosmos. They encouraged a wider perspective and that humanity should acknowledge and learn to better respect the interconnectedness they have with all living things and also life on other planets. Michel Desmarquet returned home after 10 days of travel and told his family of his experiences. His wife and daughter didn't believe him. In fact, his wife and he eventually divorced after this experience. And one of the key reasons why is because he refused to ever say that the events of June 1987 didn't happen. She simply didn't believe him, and he simply stuck to the story. He had said it was 100% true. He also spent the rest of his life experiencing tremendous backlash for his story. He wrote the book that he was instructed to write, which can be found with two possible titles. It was originally called Abduction to the Ninth Planet, and then was later republished, I think after his death actually, under the title Theouba Prophecy. Michel tried to get the book published for 5 years, but he insisted that his story was true. And while the publishers were happy to publish his book, they wanted to do so as a science fiction book. Michel refused to allow that and insisted that the book be published as non-fiction. And so he ended up having to publish it himself. He got some interest from the UFO community when the book first came out, but quite a number of people put him under pressure to become a figurehead or a spiritual leader based on the principles of the book. Michel refused, saying that his purpose was not to lead others. He was simply the person who'd been told to write the book. This led to conflicts between Michel and those in the UFO community who wanted to find a central figure to worship or follow. Ultimately, Michel stuck to his story until his dying day. His son believed him and supported him all throughout his life, but his former wife and his daughter never did. He gave a few lectures about the messages he'd received from the extraterrestrials to university students here and there. I actually have seen a video of one of those lectures that he gave to a university in Australia. And he wrote a few nondescript fiction books that never really took off. But it seems he began to feel an increasing sense of ridicule and backlash about his experiences, which left him feeling somewhat bitter as the years progressed. Having read his book, I think he also allowed some of his personal ideas about what's right and wrong to bleed into his interpretations of his experiences. And that probably caused him extra backlash. But you know what? He was human, just like we all are. And even if his experience had a few flawed memories, he had been instructed to undertake a mammoth task by extraterrestrial beings that didn't appear to appreciate the burden that this would have placed on one man. Michel Desmarquet ultimately left Australia and moved to Vietnam, where he lived a quiet life until he died in 2018 at the age of 86. I recently interviewed a fellow who traveled to meet with Michel Desmarquet in Vietnam just prior to his death. Michel was still very much devoted, according to my interviewee, to his recollections of having met an impossibly beautiful, shimmering, otherworldly, female-like being who imparted crucial messages that implied dire consequences for humanity if left unheeded. What makes Michel Desmarquet so interesting is that he, just like Chris Bledsoe, stuck to his story relentlessly, even if it meant a lifetime of backlash and no real benefit to his life whatsoever. And whether you like the man or not, that quality in a person is something that adds to their credibility. Why stick to your story if it means you end up having to hide away from the world? Why not just let go of your story if it will make life easier? Unless, of course, the story is a genuine recollection of your experience. So the interview that I did with regards to Michel Desmarquet appears on the Ellie Dreams Down Under channel, and it's called Extraterrestrial Warning to the Earth. You can find it in the UFO playlist at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. I won't go into much detail when it comes to the ghostly version of similar visions. There are, however, examples all over the world that have been documented and observed by millions across a span of hundreds of years that we know of, where a ghostly figure of a lady dressed in white appears in a church or a house or in any location, really. Some of the encounters have involved a single experiencer. Others have occurred repeatedly with many witnesses over a long and prolonged period of time. Some encounters have been photographed or filmed. Generally, there isn't much in the way of messaging when it comes to ghostly apparitions, but the lady in white still seems to be a theme that crosses the boundaries of faith, spirituality, and the paranormal. So, why do people see the same sorts of beings of reported female form but perceive their encounters in so many different ways? I thought I'd rummage around and see if I could find explanations for these different perspectives. And yes, I actually found a really thorough source of information about this from reference information that usually informs the psychology profession. So let's take a look at it and see what the psychology experts have to say about why we see these things and interpret them in lots of different ways. Apparently, there are 6 general different reasons why people who experience phenomena such as the otherworldly lady, regardless of which form she takes, 6 reasons why people might interpret their experience in different ways. The first reason relates to the person's predisposition to believe certain things. People tend to be born into environments with established beliefs, and they grow up learning how the world works in accordance with those beliefs. They may splinter out into new areas and learn different beliefs, but regardless of what their beliefs are, they will have expectations about what their experience means to them. And those expectations will be based on whatever it is that they believe or don't believe. So, in the first instance, in order to see anything at all, you have to believe in paranormal phenomena. That's what the psychologists say, regardless of whether it's a ghost or an extraterrestrial or a religious figure. If you don't believe that there's some kind of a being outside of terrestrial nature, then psychologists say that you're unlikely to see anything. Our perception of the world is influenced by our expectations and our needs, and our beliefs will kick in when sensory information we're receiving is ambiguous. So, for example, if we don't really understand what we're looking for, or if we don't really understand what we're looking at, our mind tends to err on the side of what we understand. And what we understand is obviously going to be based on our beliefs. The second reason relates to personality and cognitive style. Psychologists believe that a person's personality traits play a major role in what it is that they believe, that they're seeing. Some people are more open to mystical experiences and others are far more skeptical. Cognitive style is about how we interpret ambiguous things that stimulate our senses. For example, if you're a believer in the paranormal and you live in a house with creaky floorboards or cold spots in the air, you might interpret those creaky floorboards or cold spots as being signs of paranormal forces of some kind. And if you aren't a believer in the paranormal, then you might just believe that there's an air leak in one of the windows or a nail is loose in the floorboards and that the house is settling into its old age. The third reason relates to religious background. Psychologists believe that a person's religious belief will shape their perception. For example, if you have a Christian background, you may be predisposed to see religious icons like the Virgin Mary. If you have an Eastern spiritual traditional background of beliefs, this might influence you to interpret your encounter as being one of a benevolent spirit or a celestial being. If you are an atheist or an agnostic, you may actually be less likely to receive any kind of supernatural perceived encounter, particularly of a celestial or spiritual nature. Now remember, this is how the psychologists explain the differences in perception. I have a different view, which I'll tell you about a little bit later in this episode. Here's me arguing with the psychologists. Psychologists also say that there is a fourth reason why people's perceptions of what they've encountered may differ, and that relates to their level of fear and anxiety. Fear is something that's described as being able to open or close your mind to paranormal experiences. And also it cross-references with religion, because religion is known to ease people's anxiety when it comes to death, but it may paradoxically increase their anxiety and sensitivity to visions of ghosts and spirits during their lifetime. The reason for that is a bit like telling someone not to think of a pink elephant, which of course tends to make them immediately think of a pink elephant. Religious teachings, especially the Christian religion, involves warnings of demonic apparitions that are attempting to sway a Christian's faith. And there is a lot of fire and brimstone referencing about people who didn't stay true to Christ and his teachings, etc., and the abominations of non-Christian spirituality like tarot readings, psychics, mediums, and other non-Christian spiritualists. So if a person with deeply held beliefs of religious based apprehension relating to the occult or non Christian spiritual encounters may often see things that they interpret to be satanic or demonic, or conversely, they may interpret their visions as being safely Christ like or Virgin Mary like, so that they can reassure themselves that they aren't being tempted by the dark forces. So, according to psychologists, the fifth reason relates to cultural context. The cultural narratives, depending on your ethnicity and where in the world you've lived or have been raised, is going to shape what you believe you've encountered. For example, in Western culture, ghosts, extraterrestrials, and religious figures are prominent explanations for unusual sightings or phenomenon. But in indigenous cultures, nature spirits or ancestors may be believed to be the explanation of what's occurred. So, indigenous people who happen to see something unusual or a very strange, inexplicable phenomena around them are likely to interpret that as being one of their ancestors coming back to communicate with them. That's really interesting. And then the sixth reason that psychologists believe we differ in our perspective of what it is that we're encountering when it comes to an unusual phenomenon or phenomena relates to our evolutionary predisposition. They say that humans may actually be evolutionarily wired to perceive mysterious or threatening entities. And so, ambiguous environments or things that trigger stimuli may also trigger our alertness. It's a bit of that flight or fight kind of theory, I guess. So, if we see something that we don't understand, for the evolutionary reasons, we are predisposed to conjure up a threat of some kind so that we know that we have to run or fight or play dead. Yeah, I'm not sure that I actually can be sold on this last one. I think that telling us that we have an evolutionary wiring inside us that makes us conjure up a lady in shimmering white, in a shimmering white gown, floating 6 feet above the ground with bare feet, is just pushing it a little bit too far for me. But what do I know? I'm not a psychologist. So that's what the psychologists say. Then again, an increasing number of psychologists, and that includes certified university trained degree holding psychologists, an increasing number of those kinds of psychologists are also beginning to embrace the spiritual side of healing the mind. I happen to personally know a psychologist here in my local area who has two practices operating side by side. 2 to 3 days a week, she offers the traditional psychology practice where she uses her university taught methods of psychoanalysis to help people to heal in that traditional way. And then 2 to 3 days a week, she has a spiritual practice operating from the same location where she undertakes energy healing and taps into the Akashic records. That's something. So, how do psychologists explain that phenomenon? Which of the six reasons do you suspect they would apportion onto this particular psychologist, who is a traditional psychologist 2 to 3 days a week, and then an energy healer for the other 2 to 3 days of the week that her practice is open? I do respect our sciences tremendously, in fact. However, I also believe that all of the sciences, and that includes psychology, don't account for everything that occurs in the life of every human everywhere in the world. And there are so many people out there, regardless of where they live in the world, how old they are, what their beliefs are, and what the influences are in their life, their experiences, their family upbringing, their preferences, call it whatever you like. Regardless of what names or descriptions we use, There are millions of people out there in the world who have experienced so many extraordinary things. And even now in 2024, with all of our scientific advances, we still don't really know what it is that they're experiencing. And so, as much as I do respect science, including psychology, the psychology sciences, I don't quite think that they're taking account of all of the possibilities. Not yet, anyway. I think we still have more to learn on that front. So, anywho, I have never encountered a vision of a shimmering lady wearing white who gave me messages for all of humanity. But I have had an experience that this episode reminds me of, and I want to test it against what the psychologists say. Let's just say that it definitely got my heart pumping. A few years ago, I moved into an old house in Britain. It actually was a lovely old house. It was around 100 years old, and prior to me, the person who lived there was an elderly man who had spent about 50 years of his life living with his wife and raising his family there. His children ultimately got married or moved out of the house for whatever reason, and so he and his wife lived there, just the two of them, for a number of years as well, until his wife became ill. I actually had neighbours that I got to know after I moved in, and they knew the couple well, and they became friends with them as well. They told me about the couple's story. The wife had become ill and was bedridden for a few years, with her husband acting as her carer. She ultimately passed away, and then he lived there in the house by himself for a number of years. When I bought the house from this man, I think I recalled that he was 89 or so years old, and he was selling the house because it had become too much for him to manage on his own. So he was moving after all these years. He was moving in with his son and his son's family up north, on the northern side of England, about as far away from where he had lived for the past 50 years. He was just too elderly and frail to live alone anymore. Shortly after moving into the house, I went to bed one night. You know, the usual routine. I remember that I had just gotten into bed. It had only been a few seconds, and I immediately turned over onto my side. I was facing away from the window and towards the door of the bedroom. And suddenly, I felt someone getting into bed behind me. I felt the mattress sinking. As you can imagine, the sensation of someone getting into bed behind me got my attention, especially because I knew for a fact that I was in the house alone. And it really took me by surprise. I kind of instinctively whipped my head around to see what it was that had caused the indentation in the bed mattress behind me. And lo and behold, what I saw was the true to life, full sized vision of a man. He must have been in his 40s, maybe his mid 40s. He'd gotten into bed just like a husband or boyfriend would do, like it was a perfectly normal thing to do. And he was looking me right in the eye with a cheeky grin, as though he knew it was going to be a great night. He was facing me, and his posture was just like mine, as though he was getting ready to spoon me, as couples do, just like you'd expect the typical couple to do in bed. And I'll never, ever forget the cheeky smile on his face. I remember the shape of his face, his eyes, everything. And that cheeky smile, it was unforgettable. Well, I can tell you now that it scared the bejesus out of me. I have never moved so fast in my life. I bounded. I jumped out of bed like I was jet fueled with wings, and my heart was pumping in my chest like you can't even imagine. To suddenly, when I'm fully awake, encounter some random guy I've never met before as he's getting right into bed with me, as though he does it every night. It was exactly as though I had just gotten into bed and the man had also gotten into bed almost at the same time as I did, just like what would happen with a couple who were living together in the same house. Gosh. And going to bed together at night at the same house, in the same way, in the same bedroom, where they'd shared the same bed every night for years. So, yeah, I jumped like a world class athlete, which is very rare for me, and my heart was pounding. As I stood there, I instantly turned around to double check what I had just seen, and then the vision was instantly gone. But the thing is, the face was familiar. It was a younger version of the man that I'd bought the house from. I'm absolutely certain of that. And that moment, well, After I'd gotten my heart rate back to normal anyway, I realized that what I'd seen was a spiritual imprint from a point in time in the history of this man's life. He was a very elderly man, and having to move out of the home that he'd lived in for 50 or so years of his life, where all of his memories were, it must have taken a real toll on him. He had to move from the southern area of England up to the most northern point of the country. He suddenly lived in someone else's home, and yes, it was his son's home, but it wasn't his home. His lifestyle would have been instantly changed forever. He probably would have suddenly been lacking some of his independence, leaving behind everything and everyone that he knew. It must have been a massive upheaval for him. And actually, even the climate, it would have been very, very cold for him compared to where he'd been living before. And perhaps shortly after moving, it was just, that coupled with his frailty and his advanced age, perhaps it was just one thing too many. And I believe he probably had passed away at that moment. And what I was experiencing was a snapshot of his life with his wife at the house that they must have loved after so many years of living there together and raising their family. The man that I saw that got into bed with me unexpectedly was a cheeky husband getting ready to be playful with his wife in the way that often happens in a marital bedroom all over the world. The look on his face was one of carefree expectation, as though he and his wife were looking forward to a moment of intimacy together and were going to be having some fun. I believe that what I experienced there was the spiritual imprint of the man's life. Perhaps it was a moment that was an important one in his life, or maybe a moment that he had often reflected on after his wife passed away. Maybe because he missed her and was remembering days of love and laughter and closeness. I continued to live in that house for around 3 years, and I really, really loved that house. I even miss it now, and I've been gone for 9 years. It had a wonderful vibe that I believe was born from having been inhabited for half of its existence by a family that was probably loud and boisterous and chaotic and loving and full of affection and experiences. And I feel really privileged to have seen a glimpse of one of those happy moments in the man's life, despite the fact that it scared me silly in the moment. It was just a flash of a moment, a spiritual imprint that was probably part of the man's memories of joy that he experienced or that he remembered from time to time. It's a privilege to have been part of that. And I'm not sure which of the 6 boxes my experience would fit into, according to the psychologists. So, was it because of my belief and expectations, for example? No, I don't think it was. It had nothing to do with my spiritual beliefs, and I certainly couldn't have been expecting to see anything get into bed with me when I knew I was home alone and hadn't noticed anything happening around me to prompt an expectation of any kind. Was it because of my personality and cognitive style? No, I don't think it was. I was single. I had no issue with dating or being intimate with a partner. I don't normally sense something moving nearby or immediately, jump to a ghostly conclusion. I had a dog and a cat living in the house with me, and that would have been my first thought that either the dog or the cat had jumped onto the bed. So, was it because of my religious background? No, I don't think so. I was born into a family that went to church exactly once a year. We all went for Easter Sunday, and even today I have no idea why, because for the remainder of the year, my parents didn't speak of or even think about religion. Although, for a short time when I was very, very young, they did send me to Sunday school for about 6 months of my life when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old. But honestly, I think that they only did that because they wanted to have some quiet time alone and get me out of the house. And I was probably at my most demanding when I was 5 or 6. And so they probably just wanted to have a few hours without me. I really have no religious context to draw from. So, no, I don't think I saw what I saw due to any kind of religious background. So, was it because of fear and anxiety? Yeah, oh gosh, a very, very, very small maybe. I mean, I don't remember being afraid of anything in that house. It wasn't my first night in the house. It must have been maybe 3 to 6 months after I'd moved in. So there wasn't any reason to be fearful or anxious. I'd already settled in. I had also lived with a dog who also always had my back. He was very protective. The street was friendly and uneventful. Nothing scary had happened to me that might have put me on edge. But a very small maybe. I guess I'll just keep my mind open to perhaps it being a maybe. And it's a very generous maybe. The only thing I can think of that was that maybe there was something else in my life or my job or a relationship or something that was nagging at me at the time. And maybe I transferred my anxiety about that, which would have been very mild anxiety, if anything at all, onto that moment instead. I'm really pulling real hard to find something here. Was it because of a cultural thing? No. I can't even think of how that would fit. It was such an unexpected moment that I'm even stretching myself to consider it anything other than purely spontaneous and unprovoked and unexpected. And finally, was it an evolutionary predisposition? Uh, So, when I feel an unexpected sensation, my first evolutionary inspired predisposition is to believe that some stranger has just jumped into bed beside me. I don't know. Given that nothing like that has ever happened before or after this single incident, I'm obviously not predisposed to think that kind of thing. So, a firm no on that one. I fully believe with 100% of my fiber, my being, that I experienced a spiritual imprint of a moment in the life of a man who'd lived in my house before me. And there is nothing in the world of science to explain that. Not yet, anyway. And so when it comes to the many millions of people in the world from all kinds of ethnicities and cultures and beliefs and lifestyles who suddenly report having seen a female being of otherworldly origins, whether she be extraterrestrial, celestial, or ghostly in nature, and she seems to be shimmering and white and impossibly beautiful, or wearing white and impossibly beautiful. Well, I think that if we set aside the wishful thinkers and the wannabe experiencers and the mentally impaired and the fame chasers and the people with poor vision, or those who've been duped by a trick of the light or a practical joke, if we weed out all of those kinds of people, because, admit those people do exist, we are still left with a very large number of people representing every country of the world who have seen what they have seen. And it makes me wonder if perhaps there are two possible explanations that science is still trying to wrap its head around. The first is the explanation relating to parallel reality, and the second is the concept of perceived reality. Parallel reality is also sometimes called multiverse reality, and it relates to the existence of multiple universes that coexist simultaneously. Each universe may vary slightly or even drastically. Every universe exists independent from every other universe, and it has its own physical laws and constants and conditions. Everything that occurs in every universe allows the realities that exist to shift within their own universe, but also perhaps for a moment, an aspect of one universe can somehow sift into a different universe, like a glitch in the matrix of that universe, or like a small tear in the fabric that keeps each universe separated from the other. Maybe these visions appear as a ghost in one universe, and a celestial being in another universe, and an extraterrestrial in another universe, or the Virgin Mary in another universe. And maybe the vision of the cheeky guy who jumped into bed with me was simply a glitch in the matrix of this universe that allowed the briefest of glimpses from an alternative universe or an alternate universe with a younger man whose wife was still alive to peek for a moment into the universe where I exist, in the version of reality that placed me in the same place in the same moment. And of course, the other concept is the one of perceived reality, and it's very simple. And that relates to the idea that we live in the reality that we create for ourselves. So, some experiencers who encounter a lady of otherworldly existence perceive her to be a religious icon because that is the reality that they have created for themselves. Another person may create the reality where she appears as an androgynous or hermaphrodite extraterrestrial or a ghostly apparition. No two people can be guaranteed to experience exactly the same reality if this is the case, because the concept of reality is subjective and individualized under this theory. And so it doesn't really explain those phenomena that were simultaneously witnessed by 20,000 or so people, like the vision of the lady in the sky that was experienced in 1945 in the Bronx in New York, or the Lady of Fatima vision, which included as many as 70,000 people in Portugal in 1917, when the sun shifted from one color to another and another and another, and then grew in size so rapidly that people en masse became panicked because they were certain it was falling down onto the earth. You know, there's another possibility. Maybe it's none of the things that we think it might be. Maybe there is more that we simply don't know anything about yet. But what remains is the recognition that something out there is trying to warn us. Over and over again, humanity is being told to please, please, please do better. Spend less time hating each other, judging each other, and making each other and everything around us suffer and deteriorate. The messages we keep getting are that we need to be more compassionate towards one another, to preserve the earth and everything in life, and to act as a guardian towards all forms of life, whether it's animal or vegetable or mineral, because our very existence relies upon us choosing to be better, less greedy, less cruel, less intolerant, less uncaring or dismissive, and more kind, more inclusive, more aware of our interconnectedness with everything in the universe. And finally, you know, there is another possibility that I think nobody has really thought of before. What if all of the different ways in which people experience different types of strange and unusual phenomena actually has nothing to do with us at all? What if it all boils down to an entity out there that is desperately trying to communicate an important message, but we just aren't listening? And so they keep trying new ways to reach us. They try the spiritual route, but it falls on deaf ears. So they try the alien messenger route and nothing from us at all. And so they try glitches in the matrix and freak storms and wars and sinkholes and pandemics and chronic illnesses and heat waves and religious visions and mental illness, world poverty. And, you know, what does it take for us to finally get the message? When are we going to get the message that they're trying to send us? When are we just going to listen to what we're being told? Perhaps it is simply a matter that we are being told that we have a choice to make. We're reaching a crossroad. We can choose the path of ascension and progression forward into a higher frequency, something better, something lighter, and closer to the utopia that we all crave. Or we can choose the road that ultimately leads us to nowhere. When are we just going to shut up and listen? If you'd like to know more about what I do, then visit me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. You can also find me on Facebook, Threads, Instagram, Patreon, and Shopify. Just look for Ellie Dreams Down Under or visit my YouTube channel for all of my social media links. And don't forget to check out Patreon for extra content on today's topic and a wide variety of ad-free videos. Thanks to everyone who's joining me today on KGRA's variety of platforms. Don't forget that if you'd like to become a member of the KGRA broadcasting community so that you can chat with like-minded folk during any of KGRA's video broadcasts, just use promo code Ellie, that's me, to get 30% off your subscription. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.